In today's deep dive, we're going to take a look at Zon-Kuthon, the Midnight Lord and the Prince of Pain. Originally a being by the name of Umbral, son of the spirit wolf Thrawn, he shared the domains of beauty, art, and love with his half-sister Shaylin. Occasionally bickering, but otherwise a steadfast team, they even wielded a shared signature weapon, the Golden Glaive known as the Whisperer of Souls. But in the current world of Golarion, the entity that was Umbral is no more, has long since been corrupted and warped into the twisted and horrifying form of Zon-Kuthon. This video, much like my Lamashtu video, has a content warning on it. Zon-Kuthon is a vile and sadistic god, and many of the topics covered are very dark in nature. For this reason, viewer discretion is advised. If you ever had the misfortune to see Zon-Kuthon in the flesh, there would be no mistaking his gruesome and tortured appearance. Like all gods, his true appearance varies, but his form always retains the iconic hallmarks of the Prince of Pain. His flesh is pale, bloody, and usually hairless, but he has been seen with wispy blonde hair at times. However, across his pallid skin are bloody red wounds, many of which are held open with hooks, straps, and splints. In places, his skin is entirely missing, revealing bare muscle or bone, but this doesn't even begin to cover his sinister accessories. He sports many brutal piercings, sometimes through muscle or entirely through bone, with bits of jewelry or remnants of his victims hanging from them. Even his face doesn't escape this treatment, with spikes and hooked straps pulling the skin upon his face in strange ways. His lips are removed to show bloody teeth, and an eye torn out and replaced with a crystal of strange origin are the build-up to his crowning achievement. The entire back half of his skull is missing, revealing open bone and brains. Reminiscent of Pinhead, he wears a vertical metal crown of spikes protruding from his head, pulling his skin into a gory splay over the exposed flesh of his brain. In most mortal representations of him, he is simply shown as a pale, emaciated human with a prominent wound of some form. His holy symbol is a bleached skull with a chain, often covered in spikes, looped through each of the eye sockets. Umbral assisted in a number of important events during the Age of Creation, with his largest contribution being during the fight against Rovagug, the Rough Beast. After the gods succeeded in imprisoning Rovagug into his cage at the center of Golarion, Umbral would go on to create the Star Towers that dot Golarion, and act as rods that strengthen the walls of Rovagug's prison. However, as with all good things in Umbral's stories, these would not escape unscathed. Both deities of renowned beauty themselves, Umbral would eventually feel a dark jealousy growing within himself that eventually led to a huge falling out between him and his sister. Umbral would forsake Golarion and depart for the great beyond, exploring the cosmos for an unknown amount of time. Sometime during his travels, Umbral would venture off the beaten path and head into the dark tapestry between worlds, but we do not know why, when, or how he would learn of this dangerous path. When the god that was once Umbral returned to Golarion, he would return as a dark and twisted being known as Zon-Kuthon, the newly christened Prince of Pain. He abandoned his positions over beauty, art, love, and music, and took up the mantles over darkness, loss, envy, and most prominently, pain. Upon his return, his father, the great wolf spirit Thrawn, was overjoyed to see his son return, even in his new and twisted form. However, Zon-Kuthon held no warm feelings for his father, and he immediately bound his father in razor-sharp chains and secreted him away to the Shadow Plane to torture him at the Dark God's leisure. Over time, Thrawn's mind, body, and very soul were stripped from him, and now he serves as his son's herald, the Prince in Chains. Shaylin was infuriated at this betrayal and immediately confronted him. Her pleas and begs for Umbral to snap out of it were met with violence that her loving brother would never have been capable of, at which point she realized her brother was truly lost. battle raged on between the pair, and eventually, Shaylin would break Zon-Kuthon's hold on the golden glaive they once shared. Once disarmed, she couldn't bear to slay her brother, so the pair began an uneasy truce that remained in place, more by avoiding acknowledging each other than any desire to actually coexist. Over the centuries since his return, Zon-Kuthon has proven to be one of the most twisted, vile, and sadistic gods that Golarion has to offer. After centuries of committing crimes against Golarion, Abadar, the god of culture, made a bargain with Kuthon, in an attempt to punish the dark god. Zon-Kuthon would willingly go into exile on the Plane of Shadows for as long as the sun hung in the sky, in exchange for an item of his choosing from Abadar's legendary First Vault. The imprisonment was honestly meant to last long enough that under normal circumstances, with no sun in the sky, civilization would have long since ended. But after Earthfall and the following Age of Darkness, the sun was blotted out in the sky, technically fulfilling the bargain, and Abadar released Zon-Kuthon back to the material plane, in accordance with the contract that was cut short against his intentions. Not only was Zon-Kuthon set upon a world already reeling from the impact of the Earthfall, he did so with the power he claimed from the First Vault, the first undead shadow. During Earthfall, in -5293 AR, Golarion as a whole was about to be pummeled by the Starstone and its debris. If you're interested in learning more about Earthfall, you can click that video up top now. However, Nidal, one of the nations in Avestan, was desperate to save their people, but more importantly, their beloved horses, which would never survive in the retreat below ground. They searched far and wide for protection, and eventually they blindly bargained with the Dark God for his protection. Zon-Kuthon accepted their deal and used his vast powers to shield the country, preventing the destruction of Nidal. Overnight, Nidal was transformed from wandering nomads to one of the last standing civilizations in Avestan as new-founded Kuthonites. Even to this day, Nidal is still primarily a Zon-Kuthon worshipping country, powerful and wealthy. Whether intentional or not, the nation under his guidance appears to always be playing a longer game than its rivals are prepared for. Somehow, the god has proven to have a very keen foresight, and has ruled Nidal accordingly through his servants, the Umbral Court. For example, when Cheliax made moves to take Nidal, the Nidalese prepared to fight to their last breath to defend their country from these invaders. But surprisingly, they received orders from the Black Triune, the leaders of the Umbral Court and the true rulers of Nidal, and the Dark Prince's direct servants, to surrender and negotiate for peace. This was despite the nation's brutal reputation in combat, and, for all appearances, their forces were holding. During the next 300 years, however, the flow of ideals and cultures from Nidal was so vast that it brings into question who came away from the negotiating table better off, with Cheliax falling into hellish worship under their influence. At the end of these 300 years came the death of Eridan, the god of humanity, and Cheliax's subsequent collapse into civil war. Now an independent player, Nidal threw its support behind the hellish faction of House Throne, and suddenly, Nidal had gained a new diabolical ally. Outside of Shaylin, Kuthon is a god of few relationships, whether they be friendly or hostile. He sees little need for diplomacy, as long as he is allowed to continue playing and torturing his many toys. He has shown no desire to even interact with rival deities, preferring to subtly guide Nidal and his clergy to his own ends, passing down guidance that at the time may appear random or counterintuitive, but usually ends up positioning his followers in favorable situations. Truly, he is one of few gods with no apparent interest in others, beyond making sure they stay out of his way. This is less because he wishes to be alone, and more because other gods are wary of him. Zon-Kuthon resides within the Shadow Plane, ruling from what was once his prison. Zovacaen was supposed to last for all time, sealing him deep within its depths. but after fulfilling his deal with Abadar, he was able to leave far sooner than intended. After claiming the first shadow from Abadar, he returned to the Shadow Realm and turned Zovacaen into his own domain, a prison palace where unspeakable horrors happen. Pitch black walls of obsidian rise from the ground to pierce the clouds above, with pained screams drifting from its black depths. If you're interested in learning more about the Shadow Plane, there will be a link up top. Primarily, the Velstric can be found in the Shadow Plane, endlessly searching for a target for their whips and chains. Beings that appear to exist solely to spread their sadism, they are truly ideal followers for Zon-Kuthon. Dominic the Unquenchable. Once a member of the Kuthite military, Dominic was killed then raised again as a vampire. Members of the Kuthite church would eventually capture and torture him, slicing his abdomen to ribbons and removing his fingernails. Strangely enough, even though the torture didn't kill him, his advanced vampiric regeneration has never healed these wounds. As he feeds, the blood spills down his throat and out of holes in his abdomen, leaving him permanently starved for warm lifeblood. As such, he is constantly ravenous, and is prone to throw himself upon a foe and suck them dry. He prefers to seek out and fight the largest foes he can, to feed him for as long as he can drink upon them. Once Kuthon's own father, the Prince in Chains is a horrible amalgamation of chain and flesh that seems to take on a wolf's shape. Tortured for unknown centuries, the Prince in Chains now revels in pain, in inflicting it and receiving it. It prefers sentient agony over the suffering of animals, but it has been known to slaughter beloved pets or familiars just to bask in the pain it causes. Now, it generally can be found within the walls of Zovacaen, but will return to the material plane if offered human flesh for consumption. Clerics of Zon-Kuthon view a wound received from the prince as a massive blessing, but such a wound is rarely survivable. Of course, any mention of the Prince of Chains to a cleric of Shaylin is sure to anger them, due to the lasting wounds this has caused their goddess. Hall is one of the more mysterious of his servants, also known as the Fiend whose wounds are like wombs, and is a tall and lithe chitin evangelist. A member of the Fiends known as Velstrics, Vreet is sure to burn itself into your memory at sight alone. Its own weapons constantly slice and scratch its own flesh, drawing cuts that open to reveal half-formed eyes, waggling tongues, and cysts that weep living maggots. Vreet Hall speaks through a permanent wound in its throat, likely some form of stab wound. It has a deep fondness for wine, drugs, and living slaves. Its gender is unclear, and it appears there may have been surgery long ago to remove any trace of the creature's sex. Zon-Kuthon teaches that pain is the ultimate pleasure and sacrifice, and that the inflicting and enduring of pain is the truest show of strength. If you experience pain and you learn to embrace it, you are able to purge the weakness of your body and soul. Many things that mortals fear stem from fear. Fear of loss, fear of pain, fear of hunger. But if you can learn to embrace all these forms of pain, whether they be physical or emotional, you free yourself of such fears. Followers seek to perfect the inflicting of pain, and look to Kuthon and his spiked chains as the primary means to spread this knowledge. The anguish Zon-Kuthon teaches is more than just physical pain though. He also teaches his followers to understand and overcome psychological pain, where he breaks down morality and twists compassion into a numb pragmatism. There appears to be very few ways to directly contact one-on-one with Kuthon, but he will offer brief and ambiguous help. A slave being whipped may pray for relief, and find that the pain of the lash turns sexual, but also elevates the pain. A count who prays for help from a group of invading orcs may gain the help of a cruel warlord who takes over the lands as his own and becomes an even worse menace. Despite these poisons and risks, followers will still pray to Kuthon for help, and he has countless minions that are devoted to listening to these prayers and searching through them for those who are true members of the Kuthonite faith. Zon-Kuthon puts forth relatively few edicts that his followers should follow. Considered highest among them are that you should endeavor to bring pain to the world by any means necessary, and that you should show your devotion to the Dark God through self-mutilation and torture. A true Kuthonite must never provide comfort to those who suffer, whether that be emotional or material comforts. They bring pain and pleasure to the world, but rarely one at the expense of the other. They must never create permanent or long-lasting sources of light. While the more literal interpretation refers to physical light sources, such as an ever-burning torch, it could also be used to refer to metaphorical lights. For example, you must never become a beacon for good or righteousness. If it hasn't become obvious so far, Zon-Kuthon and his followers are typically lawful evil, but also include lawful neutral and neutral evil followers. They follow the natural hierarchy of the strong, preying upon the weak, for food, entertainment, sex, or simply dominance. Generally, sadists, masochists, and those who are so emotionally warped that only never-ending pain can distract them from their sorrows choose to worship Zon-Kuthon and his unholy church. Mothers who starve themselves over a lost child, farmers who lash their animals a little too hard to make them move faster, and even groups that require rites of pain to join are watched carefully by Zon-Kuthon. Assassins who use non-lethal poisons to inflict harm, or fighters who wish to use their pain to fuel their anger and strength may offer up unsaid pleas to this dark god, even if they would be wise not to say so publicly. Torturers, such as inquisitors, may pray to Zon-Kuthon for assistance in keeping their victims lucid as long as possible while pushing their pain ever higher. Permanent temples are rare, so Kuthites have a few practices for temporary worshipping places. They will secretly stash a representation of the Dark Prince within a torture site, usually a preserved corpse dressed as the god, or a victim that has been disfigured, or they simply pray to an icon of torture, such as an Iron Maiden. In more permanent places of worship, the torture chambers will contain more lavish decorations, such as mosaics depicting pain and torture, containing actual living victims that still writhe in pain. In smaller locations, or areas where his worship is banned, his followers may take up residence within secret caves or basements where cultists can meet, littered with small torture devices that can be reasonably passed off as practical farming or crafting tools if discovered by those outside the faith. New temples can be created at the sites where someone else was brutalized, lawful or otherwise, such as the burning of a necromancer. As Kuthites find these locations, they may leave small offerings, such as a few drops of blood, animal skulls, sharpened steel, and so on, causing such places to slowly develop a sinister atmosphere of suffering and evil that calls out to Zon-Kuthon and his faithful. Services to Zon-Kuthon always include torture, with the greater the amount of pain created, the better the offering. Skilled practitioners of pain will find ways to keep their victims on the verge of death for days at a time, by drug or magic to keep them in utter agony as long as possible. Clever clergy will come up with poetic tortures for members of the other churches. The Inner-Sea God's sourcebook mentions putting gold slivers beneath the fingernails of Abadar's priest, or Marth larvae into the eyes of Desna's faithful, or attaching red-hot iron bars to the feet of Torag's mini-smiths. This next part is especially morbid, but I feel it really shows how depraved Zon-Kuthon's faithful can be. A larger temple of Zon-Kuthon will have a scream choir within its walls, manned by either slaves or victims of flesh warping that have been alchemically or surgically changed to be able to emit only a single pained scream when harmed, Groups of them are played by a skilled cleric of Kuthon. Many of these churches practice the blurring of pleasure and pain, and other practices that are a bit too much for me to dive into here. If you're truly interested in learning every sordid detail, much of this information is from the Inner Sea Gods sourcebook. If, unlike these victims, you would like to earn Zon-Kuthon's favor, join my Discord. He's our admin bot, and he has promised me he won't hurt you too badly. While you're at it, click that subscribe button and drop me a comment. Kuthon's church is mostly independent. Each cell or temple has a self-contained hierarchy, based on a mix of physical and magical power, ingenuity, and willingness to inflict and endure pain. Rivals within each church will gather in front of their peers and inflict pain upon themselves until one party concedes, cannot continue, or dies. Not only does this prove the winner is stronger and can take more pain, but with that many witnesses, their own reputation grows. Typically, there isn't much need for communication between the various churches. The churches of Zon-Kuthon rarely push large-scale goals, so it's unusual for them to band together. Instead, they prefer to spread blood and horror into different societies, chiseling away at small pieces of normal life at a time. Typically, a Kuthite priest will operate with a single goal: bring pain to the entire world. Without the guiding hand of Zon-Kuthon, many clerics seek power without becoming overly zealous. This leads many clerics to find the Kuthon Church to be a secondary calling, leaving them free to focus on conquest, wealth, magical power, or whatever they're wishing to gain. Some join because they're simply tired of conventional delights and seek a darker thrill, while those who zealously join the church are usually mad or already have a history of torturing animals and wish to move up to larger game. Such sadists typically tend to rise to the top of the church because of their innate lust and desire for pain. Despite what you may expect, many Kuthite clerics are very skilled healers. This ability is needed to stretch torture as long as possible. In remote areas or places where magic is scarce, a Kuthite may gain a day reputation as a skilled surgeon or a powerful healer, gaining renown and reputation by day, while they slice and slay by night. Kuthites tend to become very protective of his community, seeing them as his own toys and jealously guarding them. For example, if bandits were to attack, a Kuthite would track them down, torture them for days on end, and spread their body parts as grisly trophies in a circle surrounding the bandits' camp. Many of Zon-Kuthon's paladins are victims of intense torture, so long and prolonged that their very beliefs have become warped. They often are victims of Stockholm Syndrome and gain a twisted sense of devotion to their tormentors. Those who can break a paladin are raised to new levels of respect, and many low-level Kuthonites dream of breaking a holy warrior. The church has no standard garb, though most dress in fetish versions of their god's own garments. Body modification and self-mutilations are the norm, and nearly expected, with the most extreme cases interweaving their mutilations in clothing, to the point that undressing would actually kill them. Both more extreme cultists and those in more civilized company are quick to learn how to conceal these wounds from the public, and how to keep them clean and free of infection. The most zealous within the church will hide their wounds by disguising themselves as lepers or monstrous half-breeds, or by wearing the hide of past victims to cover their own wounds. Some of the more skilled flesh artists are able to perform feats of the flesh that I am not going to be covering in this video, but again, feel free to check them out in the Inner Sea Gods book. Zon-Kuthon's holy book is bound in flayed skin, with pages made of the same ghastly material. Known as the Umbral Leaves, it contains all known fragments of Zon-Kuthon's history and prophecies spoken by members of his cult. The words are etched into the surface of the leather pages and stained with blood to make them readable. Older copies may have notes interspread throughout the text that attempt to interpret some of the more ambiguous phrases. These stories, quotes, and scraps of information are extremely ambiguous, and no two copies of the Umbral Leaves have the exact same layout, with some copies being sorted by date, others by topic, and some seemingly at random. Interpreting this book is just as much of a challenge as finding a copy. There are two stories we know of for sure from within the Umbral Leaves, that of the Broken Traveler and the Master Wrapped in Shadows. The Broken Traveler is a retelling of Dubral's travels into the dark places beyond worlds, and his eventual return to Golarion as Zon-Kuthon. However, this story tells that a foreign entity of some type possesses Dubral and forced him into a cage within his own mind, locking him away in a deep dark corner of the being that is now Zon-Kuthon. The Master Wrapped in Shadow is another retelling of how Abadar came to strike his bargain with Zon-Kuthon and goes more into the motivation of the parties involved. Abadar became aware of his crimes, of his wounding of Shaylin and corruption of his father Thrawn, and knew he had to step in and hand out a divine punishment, but instead he hesitated. He didn't know if Dubral would be able to return one day, and he knew harming Zon-Kuthon would hurt Shaylin, so he made the faithful deal instead. Kuthonites have few regularly held holidays, but they regularly host meetings on the night of the new moon, which holds significance for them. The last month of the year in the Golarion calendar is Kuthona, named after the Prince of Pain. Trigger warnings ahead, these holidays are especially grim. The Eternal Kiss. This holiday takes place on the first new moon of the year. Usually, this is an act performed on an enemy of the church, but has also been done to a favored member of the cult. For 11 days, they are pampered with exotic comforts, fine food, all the erotic companionship they can need, and any and all wants are met. On the 11th night, this shifts suddenly and they are tortured as deeply and horrifically as possible. By fire, poisons, drowning, razor blades, and dozens of other methods, this victim is brought to the very brink of death before magic is used to keep them alive. While alive, their organs are used to perform anthropomancy, searching for signs of Zon-Kuthon's will. Very rarely, the victim will begin speaking in tongues, speaking scraps of prophecies in other languages. It is truly unclear if the victim survives or not. The joy-making. One of the more bizarre masochistic beliefs that Kuthonites hold is that the less flesh a person possesses, the more concentrated the rest of their pain and pleasure becomes. In their faith, a legless man will experience purer amounts of pain and pleasure than a man with 2 good legs. This can ultimately culminate in a religious rite called the joy-making. Usually undertaken by the most wealthy, dedicated, and manic members of the church, they arrange to have all of their limbs amputated and sections of flesh flayed from their bones. Eventually, they will be left a writhing head and torso that must be fed and cleaned by other members of the Kuthonite faith. Those who go through the joy-making ceremony are the most envied within the faith, as their entire life going forward from this day is dedicated to becoming an object of pain and pleasure. They are kept within secure locations by the Kuthonite Church, where any member of the church is allowed to do as they wish. On the night of the joy-making, members of the faithful eagerly descend upon the honored individual, removing limbs and any flesh that is not required. This includes the victim's ears and nose. For Zon-Kuthon worshippers, any senses beyond pain are just more feelings you could be dedicating to the Midnight Lord. After this is complete, the remaining living flesh is now referred to as a joyful thing. It is believed that such things may one day be transformed into powerful servants of Zon-Kuthon's, such as the Velstrix. The joy-making has no set date or frequency. When a Kuthonite wishes to undergo the process, they are to make arrangements with a Kuthonite religious leader. The leader will make sure it happens, for the creation of a joyful thing is one of the highest honors they offer. In facing their god's endless darkness, worshippers will often guide themselves with messages that affirm their hopelessness. Here are a few examples. Abandon your tears. In a cult that revels in their pain, tears are evidence of weakness. When a Kuthonite cries, it shows they are not truly embracing their pain, and thus they are unenlightened. When a true cultist is tortured, they love and embrace this pain, focusing their energy into saving this line between agony and utter ecstasy. This aphorism works as a rebuttal to the unfaithful and advice to the faithful. Experience without limits. This phrase has a dual meaning. It indicates that the cult seeks physical sensation beyond the norm, both pain and pleasure, to reach new levels of sensory experiences. It also means a Kuthonite should not let society norms limit their goals and desires. If a Kuthonite wishes to taste of her sister's blood, so be it. This is an unspoken acknowledgement that everyone has this right, and thus the punisher may one day become the punished, for it is only natural that the strong will rule the weak. Warning. The following information is from a PaizoCon 2019 panel called Secrets of Golarion. It has not made its way into official Paizo products, nor is it acknowledged as official canon by Paizo. The mythology of Paizo's Golarion is steeped in hearsay and unreliable narrators, and thus the narrative given is a valid in-universe possibility. I have chosen to include this for thoroughness, as canon or not, it does help us inform ourselves of the direction that Paizo writers were planning to take with Zon-Kuthon in his past, and may still take him one day. At the panel, the following question was put forward. Is Zon-Kuthon really Dubral, or is Zon-Kuthon an alien presence and Dubral is still trapped within him? James Jacobs, creative director at Paizo and leading the panel, had this to say. At one point, I was going to have an adventure called Sanctum of the Shadow Giants, and it was going to be one of the last first edition adventures, but that didn't pan out. The idea was that you go into the Sanctum of Shadow Giants and find out the entire history of Dubral and Zon-Kuthon, kind of laid out in reliefs on the walls or whatever, ghosts and stuff like that. It didn't pan out, so that information got into the Book of the Damned and a couple of other places. But the idea is kind of that Zon-Kuthon was something that existed in a previous reality, and he realized that the universes are cyclical. They start and end, start and end, start and end. And he's like, I don't want to do that. I'm going to go set a sort of time capsule, so that when the next universe starts, whatever I reincarnate as will be lured out to get it. So Dubral was never really anything but a placeholder for what would one day become Zon-Kuthon. So to boil that down, Zon-Kuthon is simply the previous universe's Zon-Kuthon. Following this, he mentioned that some of this may be included in the Book of the Damned, but I was not able to find a single scrap of it in anything published. If you do know any official or even unofficial sources, drop them in the comments and share what you think about this possible origin story. I'd really love to hear about them. And that, my friends, covers Zon-Kuthon. We have gone through many of the evil deities in Golarion over the last year, and now we only have a single dark god left, so I hope to see you there for our final destination, the prison at the center of Golarion.